test review, part of Registry Ready TV, where we give you a little bit of a breakdown on National Registry style questions, how to break them down, what the answer is, but most importantly, why, so that you've got the right kind of test taking skills for when you go to tackle National Registry. So let's break down some questions. First question we want to break down tonight has to do with inadequate ventilations. Which of the following is the earliest signs that a patient has inadequate ventilations, right? So, I tell you, this first answer, poor skin color, is kind of tricky. Because when we think inadequate ventilations, we think, not enough oxygen, maybe not perfusing well. Maybe it's blue, and blue's a poor skin color, so we should choose that. But what happens if they're breathing too fast, 26, 27, 28 times a minute? Is that inadequate? But more specifically, is that patient that's inadequate going to display blue skin color? And the answer is no, right? The answer is no. So, that's not an option. So we're going to remove that option, okay? So we're going to focus a little bit on the next couple options, right? So, increased respiratory rate. Could that be a sign of inadequate ventilations? The answer is yes, right? B, anxiety or decreased level of consciousness. That is absolutely an indication of a patient with inadequate ventilations. And increased capillary refill time, right? That's also an indication as well. I tell you, the reason why you want to take increased respiratory rate out is increased respiratory rate is only compensation for people who aren't breathing enough, not often for people who are breathing too much. So increased respiratory rate doesn't fit with the strict definition of how the body would compensate for inadequate ventilations, right? So let's look at B and D. Anxiety and decreased level of consciousness and increased capillary refill time. Increased capillary refill time is something that happens when a patient's having inadequate ventilations, but it is not one of the earliest signs. And this question specifically requires you to really begin to put into order the signs of inadequate ventilation as they begin to appear for a patient. One of the first signs of truly inadequate ventilations is anxiety and a decreased level of consciousness. That anxiety and decreased level of consciousness is one of the first indications that, man, oh man, we have a pretty serious problem with this patient, and we need to consider changing the path that they're on to increase and improve their perfusion. Awesome. That's the first question. Let's go over another one. This question talks a little bit about anatomy. The reason why it's important to understand anatomy when you go into registry is that you'll get a lot of questions that basically break down the position of a specific portion of the body to make sure that you're clear on what each part of the body does and where it's located, right? So this question, National Registry style question, a little bit on the simpler side in its structure. It says, identify the structure located at the division of the trachea at the right and left bronchus. Now, this is a straight up, do you understand anatomy style questions. The reason why we included it in today's review is that it's important to highlight the fact that, man, if you don't know anatomy and vocab when you go into this exam, you're going to have a darn tough time passing National Registry. Well, let's talk about why this is, or the answer is what it is, right? So let's break down the options. The esophagus. Esophagus actually isn't part of that particular part of the body. It's actually behind the trachea, right? So the esophagus wouldn't be the correct answer. So we'll remove esophagus as an option. I want to talk a little bit about the bronchioles and the actual alveoli themselves. The reason why bronchioles and the alveoli are not the answer is because they're actually the distal end of the airway tree, right? When you bring air in, one of the last things that your air sees before it gets diffused into the blood, the oxygen gets removed and diffused in the blood through the gas exchange, is the bronchioles and eventually the alveoli, right? That's actually where that gas exchange begins. So it's really darn important to understand that you're not going to see that all the way up here at the bronchus. Now, what this question requires you to understand is, what does the bronchioles and the alveoli do? Because you need to understand that they're going to be the end of the airway tree, not the beginning, as well as what the bronchus is. All the more reason why it's so darn important to understand this anatomy and physiology. Unfortunately, because they're at the distal end, that actually removes both of these options, making carina the option that you would choose effectively for this particular question. We decided to give you a bit of an easy one for this particular question, right? So this particular question talks a little bit about lower leg fractures. So you splinted a lower leg fracture. The patient has a distal pulse prior to the splinting, and upon reassessment, you observe that the distal pulse is now absent. Which of the following describes the cause? The splint is too tight, the splint is too loose, you have used an improper splint, and the bones have lacerated the blood vessel. Well, I'm going to go ahead and remove bones have lacerated the blood vessel immediately because the patient has a distal pulse. And if a patient has a distal pulse initially, but then it's absent, it doesn't necessarily mean there's a laceration in the blood vessel. That's at least remarkably less likely than the correct answer. So I'm going to remove this and explain that better in a second. The splint being too loose would not put the patient in a position where they end up losing a pulse they previously had. What this leaves us with is A and C, right? You have used an improper splint, and the splint is too tight. You can make an argument that this is an improper splint because it's probably too small for the patient to cause the symptoms that they're experiencing, which is the loss of that distal pulse. That said, the most correct answer that's available to you is absolutely going to be simply that the splint is too tight. Because if the splint is too tight, right, it's going to actually wrap around that leg and begin to choke off the blood supply that's in that leg itself by simply being too tight. The only way to actually solve that is to begin to loosen that splint and make sure after splinting that you have a distal pulse. This is a good example of why your instructor, I'm certain of it, told you that every time you apply some sort of a splint, whether it's a backboard or it's a long padded board splint or whatever the kind of splint is, if there are straps that are going circumferentially around the patient, you must check pulse, motor, sensory. Because we want to make sure that this splint isn't so tight that you've actually closed off blood flow to the extremity, because that's not a good thing for the patient. So that's a breakdown of question number 3. Those are 3 simple questions that we want to kind of give some examples to and show you how breaking down a National Registry question works. I really hope this was helpful to you. We appreciate your time as always. You guys were wonderful and absolutely awesome, and we wish you guys the best success as you begin to go tackle your National Registry exam. We appreciate your time, your patience, your energy, and we look forward to seeing you in our next episode of Registry Ready TV. Have a great day.